All right, let's talk about Bran 4. Bran 4 is kind of a slow world building character development chapter that seems to be what happens when George is a little bit in a rut, as we're seeing with these chapters around Bran 4. As I mentioned last time, George got into a little bit of a rut during 1994 with a Game of Thrones, where he only wrote about 200 manuscript pages, which is fast by today's standards, but really slow compared to what he does later with just booming out the end of A Game of Thrones, A Clash of Kings, and A Storm of Swords. It's just a massive amount of writing during that period. And he doesn't really get in these ruts again until A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. But so as we'll see, this not too much happens in Bran 4. It's mostly world building and character development, and probably from the rut. But nonetheless, it'll hopefully it'll be interesting. So in the yard below, Rickon ran with the wolves. Bran watched from his window seat. Wherever the boy went, Grey Wind was there first, lopping ahead to cut him off until Rickon saw him, screamed in delight, and went pelting off in another direction. Shaggy Dog ran at his heels, spinning and snapping if the other wolves came too close. Here we see that the wolves kind of act like their owners. Rickon is shown here to be wild and young. I think fans have kind of settled into this idea that Rickon has been influenced by his wolf too much, which is something that Jojen warns Bran about, and that the wolf and Rickon have gone wild. And so Grey Wind is the leader here. And then later we're trying to find out that Bran is Summerus, the smartest. His forehead's darkened until it was all black. His eyes were green fire. That's kind of interesting that Bran's summer came last. He was silver and smoke, and his eyes yellow gold that saw all there was to see, just as Bran is going to see all there is to see, right? He's the watcher, especially in his tree. It's interesting that Shaggy Dog gets the green eyes, considering that in A Game of Thrones, in A Dance with Dragons, we find out the Green Seers have green eyes. And this is why we hear about Jojen having green eyes and the special people having green eyes. But here, Shaggy Dog has the green eyes, while Bran has yellow gold. Smaller than Grey Wind and more wary, Bran thought he was the smartest of the litter. Because Bran is the smartest of the litter, he could hear his brother's breathless laughter as Rickon dashed across the hard-packed earth on little baby legs. Rickon is what? He's 3 going on 4, I guess. Small. A 3-year-old with baby legs, I guess. His eyes stung. He wanted to be down there, laughing and running. Angry at the thought, Bran knuckled away the tears before he could fall. His 8th name day had come and gone. He was almost a man grown now, too old to cry. You get this a lot with Bran. He was almost a man grown. It's kind of like Jon flexing his fingers, or Arya biting her lip. Comes back over and over again. He was almost a man grown, almost a man grown. Of course, he's years from being a man grown, actually. So he's not too old to cry. But then again, he was taken to see an execution. So everything is all about making little kids grow up too fast. It was just a lie, he said bitterly, remembering the crow from his dream. I can't fly. I can't even run. Crows are all liars, Old Man agreed from the chair where she sat doing her needlework. I know a story about a crow. So apparently he told old Nan about his dream, right? Because right here, he just says it was a lie. I can't fly. I can't even run. And then she's the one that says crows are all liars. So she seems to know what he's talking about. So he told old Nan about his dreams, which is interesting. Because old Nan is, she might still be alive at the Dreadfort. I don't want any more stories, Bran snapped, his voice petulant. He had liked old Nan and her stories once before, but it was different now. They left her with him all day now. Oh, they left her with him all day now. watch him and clean him and keep him from being lonely. Clean him meaning, I guess she cleans his crap. But she made it worse. I hate your stupid stories. The word stupid is interesting because he only tends to use it with the kids. The kids use the word stupid. You're stupid. But everybody else, they use something else like daft or foolish or something. The old woman smiled at him toothlessly. My stories? No more, my little lord, not mine. The stories are before me and after me, before you too. That's true. She's saying they're not my stories. She was an ugly old woman, Bran thought spitefully, shrunken and wrinkled, almost blind, too weak to climb stairs. By the way, Old Nan seems to be based on a character named Old John in the story Bitter Blooms, who would be the storyteller of the culture. With only a few wisps of white hair left to cover a mottled pink scalp, no one really knew how old she was, but Father said she'd been called old even when he was a boy. She was the oldest person in Winterfell for certain, maybe the oldest person in the Seven Kingdoms. So if she's old when Ned is a boy, Ned's in his mid-30s, that means he's calling her old when she's in maybe her 50s. I think Gior is early 60s and he's called old. So, it's likely that old Nan is in her 90s. And we hear her eventually talk about her time crossing over with previous Starks. And it puts her pretty old, puts her in the 90s. Nan had come to the castle as a wet nurse for a Brandon Stark whose mother had died birthing him. This is like the generation after Dunk and Egg with the She-Wolves of Winterfell. But not that George had established this yet, but, he had been an older brother of Lord Rickard Stark, Bran's grandfather, or perhaps a younger brother, or brother to Lord Rickard's father. This gets into the history being uncertain, that history being a fog. And this Bran's Old Nan's story is this, and then we later are going to hear about, Westeros' history being a fog, because people just don't really know history. I mean, and Old Nan is losing her memory anyway. So just like the earth loses its memory, the society loses its memory. Sometimes Old Nan told it one way and sometimes another. In all the stories, the little boy died at 3 of Summer Chill. But Old Nan stayed on at Winterfell with her own children. She had lost both her sons to war when King Robert won the throne. That's interesting, is that her sons are old enough to be fighting, are in the right age. So they could be in their 40s, I suppose, but you're not sending guys off to war too much after their 50s in this society. So maybe I'm trying to think, that's 17 years before, or 15 years before. She's 15 years before at this point. So, it's making everything work really kind of is hard. Because if she's in her 90s, that means her sons, could be in, if let's say we're really pushing it and they're in their 50s, she's having those 50s boys, at the, in her early 40s. It's really hard to make the timeline work. But and her grandson was killed on the walls of Pike during Balon Greyjoy's rebellion, which wasn't that long ago. I mean, 89, so 10, 9 years. Her daughters had long ago married and moved away and died. All that was left of her own blood was Hodor, the simple-minded giant who worked in the stables, but Old Man just lived on and on, doing her needlework and telling her stories. I mean, I guess this is her great-grandson being a boy. I mean, we get the kind of mixed message on Hodor being a boy or a man, which makes us think that he's around the age of 19 or something, somewhere on the border. I don't care whose stories they are, Bran told her. I hate them. He didn't want stories, and he didn't want old Nan. Yeah. He wanted his mother and father. He wanted to go running with Summer lopping beside him. He wanted to climb the broken tower and feed corn to the crows. He wanted to ride his pony again with his brothers. He wanted to be the way he'd been before. I know a story about a boy who hated stories, old Nan said with her stupid little smile, her needle moving all the while. Click, click, click. Until Bran was ready to scream at her. It would never be the way it had been, he knew. The crow had tricked him into flying, but when he woke up, he was broken and the world was changed. They had all left him, his father and mother and his sisters, and even his bastard brother Jon. His father had promised he would ride a real horse to King's Landing, but they'd gone without him, and Maester Luwin had sent a bird after Lord Eddard with a message, and another to Mother, and a third to Jon at the Wall, but there'd been no answers. Ofttimes the birds are lost, child, the Maester had told him. There's many a mile and many a hawk between here and King's Landing. The message may not have reached them. Yet to Bran it felt as if they'd died while he had slept, or perhaps Bran had died and they had forgotten him. Jory and Sir Roderick and Van Poole had gone too, and Hullen and Harwin and Fat Tom, and a quarter of the guard. So, again, this is kind of all summary, but you're getting a little bit about how Raven's working here, but you can just see the kind of struggle that George is having here. Only Robb and baby Rickon were still here, and Robb was changed. He was Robb the Lord now, or trying to be. He wore a real sword and never smiled. His days were spent drilling the guard and practicing his swordplay, making the yard ring with the sound of steel, as Bran watched forlornly from the window. At night, he closeted himself with Maester Luwin, talking or going over accounting books. Sometimes he would ride out with Hallis Malin and be gone for days at a time, visiting distant holdfasts. Whenever he was away more than a day, Rickon would cry and ask if Robb was ever coming back. Even when he was home at Winterfell, Robb the Lord seemed to have more time for Hallis Malin and Theon Greyjoy than he ever did for his brothers. The other thing that I think is interesting about when George has trouble is the characters fall out of their voice. So normally Bran chapters are very simple and they use simple language, short sentences. And you get a bit of this in here, but then he'll throw in these poetic words like forlornly and stuff. And you're like, well, are we really in a boy's head anymore? You know? Because it takes real effort to like keep that child's voice, which I think he successfully does in Bran 1 and 2, but he kind of falls out of it here and there. And I would say he falls out of it the most in Bran 3, A Dance with Dragons, where it's like it doesn't even feel like a little boy anymore. I mean, maybe that's intentional, but I think it's a little interesting. Because just thinking that this is kind of a problem time for George. I could tell you a story about Bran the Builder, old Nan said. That was always your favorite. Thousands and thousands of years ago, Bran the Builder had raised Winterfell. And some said the Wall. Bran knew the story, but it had never been his favorite. Maybe one of the other Brandons had liked that story. Sometimes Bran would talk to him as if he were her Brandon, the baby she had nursed all those years ago, and sometimes she confused him with her uncle Brandon, who was killed by the Mad King before Bran was even born. She had lived so long, Mother had told him once, that all the Brandon Starks had become one person in her head. This paragraph, much more written like a child, right? Versus like looking out of a window forlornly. So this line as well, people kind of think about that maybe all of the Brans are one person, that time-traveling Bran is going back and controlling all of the Brans, you know? That's not my favorite. My favorites are the scary ones. He heard some sort of commotion outside and turned back to the window. Rickon was running across the yard towards the gatehouse, the wolves following him. But the tower faced the wrong way for Bran to see what was happening. He smashed a fist onto his thigh in frustration and felt nothing. "Oh, my sweet summer child," Old Nan said quietly. "What do you know of fear? Is this the first time we hear summer child?" It is. It is. Yeah. In fact, it doesn't come up too much actually, but this line, "Oh, my sweet summer child," this is of course famous in the fandom. Every time people are like, when's Wind's coming out? Oh, you sweet summer child. But again, we're just getting background and world building. Bran the Builder. And now we're getting the others. What do you know, fear? Fear for the winter, my little lord, when the snows fall 100 feet deep and the ice wind comes howling out of the north. Fear is for the long night, when the sun hides its face for years at a time, and little children are born and live and die all in the darkness, while the direwolves grow gaunt and hungry, and the white walkers move through the woods. You mean the others, Bran said querulously. All right. The others, Bran agreed. Thousands and thousands of years ago, winter fell that was cold and hard and endless beyond all memory of man. There came a night that lasted a generation, and kings shivered and died in their castles, even as the swineherds in their hovels. Women smothered their children rather than see them starve, and cried and felt their tears freeze on their cheeks. Her voice and her needle fell silent, and she glanced up at Bran with pale, flimsy eyes and asked, "So, child, is that the story you'd like?" "Well," Bran said reluctantly, "yes, only..." Old Nan nodded. "In the darkness, the others came for the first time," she said as her needles went click, click, click. They were cold things, dead bodies that hated iron and fire and the touch of the sun, and every creature with hot blood in its veins. They swept over holdfasts and cities and kingdoms, felled heroes and armies by the score, riding their pale dead horses and leading hosts of the slain. All of the swords of men could not slay their advance, and even maidens and suckling babes found no pity in them. They hunted the maids through frozen forests and fed their dead servants on the flesh of human children. So, in the end, if at least if we're going with the show, some of these sorts of things continue to appear, like hating everything with hot blood, just hating life in general, which seems to be something that they did in the show. And just the long night lasting a generation. I don't know how crops can survive that long, but this is why my idea of that it was some sort of nuclear winter, that people had bomb shelters or something, but I don't know how everyone would be able to survive without preparation. Her voice had dropped very low, almost to a whisper, and Brown found himself leaning forward to listen. Now these were the days before the Andals came, and long before the women fled across the narrow sea from the cities of the Rhoyne. That's interesting as well, that he's saying that it's only the women that came with Nymeria, before the women fled across the narrow sea from the cities on the Rhoyne. And the 100 kingdoms of those times were the kingdoms of the first men, who had taken these lands from the children of the forest. Yet here and there in the fastness of the woods, the children still lived in their wooden cities and hollow hills, and the faces in the trees kept watch. So as cold and death filled the earth, the last hero determined to seek out the children in hopes that their ancient magics could win back what the armies of men had lost. He set out in the dead lands with a sword, a horse, a dog, and a dozen companions. People read into this a lot, like, what does this mean? Like, which sword is the sword? Which horse is the horse? Is the dog the hound? Is the horse the guy on the wall that's named Horse? Who are the dozen companions? For years he searched until he despaired of ever finding the children of the forest in their secret cities. One by one, his friends died, and his horse, and finally even his dog. And his sword froze so hard the blade snapped when he tried to use it. And the others smelled the hot blood in him and came silent on his trail, stalking with the packs of pale white spiders, big as hounds. We haven't seen these white spiders yet. Some people wonder if the spiders are actually like human bodies animated, or if they're actually spiders, you know. The door opened with a bang, and Bran's heart leapt up into his mouth with sudden fear. But it was only Maester Luwin, with Hodor looming in the stairway behind him. Hodor, the stable boy announced, as was his custom, smiling hugely at them all. Maester Luwin was not smiling. "We have visitors," he announced, "and your presence is required, Bran." "I'm listening to a story now," Bran complained. "Stories wait, my little lord, and when you come back to them, why, they're there," old Nan said. "Visitors are not so patient, and oft times they bring stories of their own." "Who is it?" Bran asked Maester Luwin. "Tyrion Lannister and some men of the Night Watch, with some word from your brother, Jon. Robb is meeting with them now. Hodor, will you help Bran down to the hall?" "Hodor," Hodor happily agreed. He ducked. So Tyrion has arrived. We saw him in the Jon chapter. Not too long ago, really. I'm trying to. I think he. The Jon chapter was only. This is just amazing how fast time can go in this. But I guess Jon 3 is good 5 chapters. No, I'm sorry. Tyrion 3 is only 3 chapters back. So at least 3 weeks. At least 3 weeks have passed one, because he traversed the wall to Fell. Okay, so he ducked under the great shaggy head under the door. Hodor was nearly 7 feet tall. It was hard to believe that he was the same blood of old Nan. Bran wondered if he would shrivel up as small as his great-grandmother when he was old. It did not seem likely, even if Hodor lived to be 1,000. A lot of people make a big deal about Hodor's size. I mean, he's much, much shorter than the mountain that rides. Even though when Ned thinks about the largest people in the land, he thinks of the mountain, the hound, and Hodor. So nearly 7 feet tall. I mean, that's tall, but it's not inhumanly tall, when you get to 8 feet tall, I mean, I'm 6'6", so Hodor is only, another 6 inches taller. So I meet people that are 7 feet tall. I wouldn't say all the time, but, enough. Hodor lifted Bran as easy as if he were a bale of hay and cradled him against his massive chest. He always smelled faintly of horses, but it was not a bad smell. His arms were thick with muscle and matted with brown hair. "Hodor," he said again. Theon Greyjoy once commented that Hodor did not know much, but no doubt that he knew his name. Old Nan cackled like a hen when Bran told her that, and confessed that Hodor's real name was Walder. No one knew where Hodor came from, she said, but when he started saying it, they started calling him by it. And it was the only word he had. Hold the door. Right there and then, we're told. Yeah. But it's interesting that the name Walder doesn't even. I think this is the only time we ever hear him called Walder until the fanfic. So, I always thought that it was quite rude that they still called him Hodor when his name was Walder. But yeah, this is mostly introducing characters, just getting to know Hodor and Old Nan. They left Old Nan in the tower room and her needles with her needles and memories. Hodor hummed tunelessly as he carried Bran down the steps and through the gallery, with Maester Luwin following behind, hurrying to keep up with the stable boy's long strides. Robb was seated in father's high seat, wearing ringmail and boiled leather, and the stern face of Robb the Lord. Theon Greyjoy and Hallis Mullen stood behind him. Hallis Mullen, who, later gets Ned's bones. And so we kind of have this, where is Hallis Mullen? Where in the world is Hallis Mullen kind of idea. A dozen guardsmen lined the gray stone walls beneath the tall, narrow windows. In the center of the room, the dwarf stood with his servants and the 4 strangers in the black of the Night's Watch. Bran could sense the anger in the hall the moment that Hodor carried him through the doors. Any man of the Night's Watch is welcome here at Winterfell for as long as he wishes to stay, Robb was saying with the voice of Robb the Lord. His sword was across his knees, the steel bare for all the world to see. Even Bran knew what it meant to greet a guest with an unsheathed sword, so I guess he's threatening Tyrion here. Because Robb has been told that the Lannisters were responsible for throwing Bran out the window by Catelyn when she woke up. Any man of the Night's Watch, the dwarf repeated, but not me. Do I take your meaning boy? Robb stood and pointed at the little man with his sword. I'm the lord here while my mother and father are away, Lannister. I'm not your boy. If you are a lord, you might have learned a lord's courtesy, the little man replied, ignoring the sword pointed in his face. Your bastard brother has all your father's graces, it would seem. Jon, Bran gasped out of Hodor's arms. The dwarf turned to look at him. So it's true, the boy lives. I could scarce believe it. You Starks are hard to kill. The Lannister had best remember that, Robb said, lowering his sword. Hodor, bring my brother here. Hodor said. He trotted forward, smiling, and set Bran in the high seat of the Starks, where the lords of Winterfell had sat since the days when they called themselves the kings in the north. The seat was cold stone, polished smooth by countless bottoms. The carved heads of direwolves snarled on its ends of its massive arms. Bran clasped them as he sat, his useless legs dangling. The great seat made him feel half a baby. Robb put a hand on his shoulder. You said you had business with Bran. Well, here he is, Lannister. Bran was uncomfortably aware of Tyrion Lannister's eyes. One was black and one was green. This is this idea that maybe Tyrion is a chimera, but it's I don't know if that kind of theory is going anywhere. And both were looking at him, studying him, weighing him. I'm told you're quite a climber, Bran, the little man said at last. Tell me, how is it that you happened to fall that day? I never, Bran insisted. He never fell. Never, never, never. That's what every climber says. I don't think it's a very good argument. That everyone seems to believe this argument too. Like, Bran never falls. He's such a great climber. Like, lots of rock climbers, they die. Professional rock climbers because they fall eventually. The child does not remember anything of the fall or the climb that came before it, said Maester Luwin gently. Curious, said Tyrion Lannister. My brother is not here to answer questions, Lannister, Robb said curtly. Do your business and be on your way. I have a gift for you, the dwarf said to Bran. Do you ride, boy? Do you like to ride, boy? Maester Luwin came forward. My lord, the child has lost the use of his legs. He cannot sit a horse. Nonetheless, with the right horse on the right saddle, even a cripple can ride. The word was a knife through Bran's heart. He felt tears come unbidden to his eyes. I'm not a cripple. Then I'm not a dwarf, the dwarf said with a twist of his mouth. My father will rejoice to hear it. Greyjoy laughed. What sort of horse and saddle are you suggesting? Maester Luwin asked. A smart horse. A boy cannot use his legs to command the animal, so you must shape the horse to the rider. Teach it to respond to the reins, to the voice. I would begin with an unbroken yearling, with no old training to be unlearned. He drew a rolled paper from his belt. Give this to your saddler. He will provide the rest. Maester Luwin took the paper from the dwarf's hand, curious at the small gray squirrel. He unrolled it, studied it. I see. You draw nicely, my lord. Yes, this ought to work. I should have thought of this myself. Yes. In truth, like, at least in our world, there is a long history of saddles being built for people that have disabilities. These things, appear all over the world, thousands and thousands of years. So the idea that Tyrion being well read, like came across one of these in one of his books, is not on it's not too amazing. It's strange that he's able to have the engineering kind of foresight to do it. But if Tyrion could have come up with it, you'd think Maester Luwin would have, considering that he has a medical background and such. But they kind of lampshade it where he says, "I should have thought of this myself." It came easier to me, Maester. It is not terribly unlike my own saddles. This saddle plot, it really only gets, Jon tells Tyrion to help Bran. So Tyrion designs a saddle. So Bran receives a saddle. So Bran is out on his saddle and runs into the wildlings. Like Osha. Like, that's essentially where this plot goes. I think there probably could have been a quicker link to it all. Just have Bran being out because they took him out, in a wheelbarrow or whatever. It doesn't matter. And you could have got there without this saddle plot, which doesn't really go anywhere. But maybe it's really necessary for Bran to like Tyrion or something in the long run. Will I truly be able to ride? Bran asked. He wanted to believe them, but he was afraid. Perhaps it was just another lie. The crow had promised him that he could fly. You will, the dwarf told him. And I swear to you, boy, on horseback, you will be as tall as any of them. Robb Stark seemed puzzled. Is this some trap, Lannister? What's Bran to you? Why should you want to help him? Your brother Jon asked it of me. And I have a tender spot in my heart for cripples and bastards and broken things. Tyrion placed a hand over his heart and grinned. The door to the yard flew open. Sunlight came streaming across the hall as Rickon burst in breathless. Direwolves were with him. The boy stopped by the door wide-eyed, but the wolves came on. Their eyes found Lannister, or perhaps they caught his scent. Summer began to growl first. Grey Wind picked it up. They padded towards the little man, one from the right, one from the left. The wolves do not like your smell, Lannister, Theon Greyjoy commanded. Yeah, the wolves, direwolves, kind of universally don't like Tyrion. Perhaps it's time I took my leave, Tyrion said. He took a step backward, and Shaggy Dog came out of the shadows behind him, snarling. Lannister recoiled, and Summer lunged at him from the other side. He reeled away, unsteady on his feet, and Grey Wind snapped at his arm, teeth ripping at his sleeve and tearing loose a strap of cloth. No! Bran shouted from the high seat as Lannister's men reached for their steel. Summer here, Summer to me! The direwolf heard the voice, glanced at Bran, and again at Lannister. He crept backward, away from the man, and settled down below Bran's dangling feet. Robb had been holding his breath. He let it out with a sigh and called, Grey Wind! His direwolf moved to him, swift and silent. Now there was only Shaggy Dog rumbling at the small man, his eyes burning like green fire. Used the green fire analogy twice in the same chapter. just saying, George. He used the same analogy twice in the same chapter. Rickon called him. Bran shouted to his baby brother, and Rickon remembered and screamed, Home, Shaggy, home now. The Black Wolf gave Lannister one final snarl and bounded off to Rickon, who hugged him tightly around the neck. Tyrion Lannister undid the scarf, mopped his brow, and said in a flat voice, How interesting. Are you well, my lord? Asked one of the men, his sword in hand. He glanced nervously at the direwolves as he spoke. My sleeves is torn and my breeches are unaccountably damp, but nothing was harmed save my dignity. Even Robb looked shaken. The wolves. I don't know why they did that. No doubt they mistook me for dinner. Lannister bowed stiffly to Bran. I thank you for calling them off, young sir. I promise you, they would have found me quite indigestible. Now I will be leaving, truly. This whole thing, they're quite rude to Tyrion. There is kind of a global kind of belief in guest right and being kind to guests. That the wolves, that the Lannister, that the Starks are not really holding to too well here. And the whole idea is that when you're being kind to a guest, it's it's a double-edged sword. Like, the idea is to treat guests really hospitable. This is very true in like the Middle East. Like, the guest comes into town and people are like, come over, eat food, eat food. But it's double-edged. It's like, while you're in their house eating food, you're their captive. And also, like, once you feed, like, and you're not causing trouble in the town. And also, if you are fed, the person, it's really hard to then talk trash about somebody, you know? When somebody is good to you and gives something to you, it's really hard to talk trash about them. And so that's the whole thing about, like, oh, the stranger came into town and then I fed him, and all he can do is leave and be like, well, he didn't cause any trouble. There was no incident. And he leaves, and all he can do is tell people, oh yeah, they were really hospitable. They were fantastic. You know, you'll see this in life. Like, why buying beers for people and having parties and, you know, things like that goes a long way. A moment, my word, Maester Lewin said. He moved to Robb, and they huddled close together, whispering. Bran tried to hear what they were saying, but the voices were too low. Robb Stark finally sheathed the sword. I may have been hasty with you, he said. You've done Bran a kindness, and well, Robb composed himself with an effort. The hospitality of Winterfell is yours, if you wish it, Lannister. I'm surprised Lewin let Robb be so reckless as Lord here, like having an unsheathed sword and being so rude to Lannister. Like, that's a pretty... I mean, Robb's a teenager, fine. I can believe that he'd want to do that, but Lewin should have been like, dude, let's chill. This is like, you treat guests properly. Spare me your false courtesies, boy. You do not love me, and you do not want me here. I saw an inn outside your walls in the winter town. I'll find a bed there, and both of us will sleep easier. For a few coppers, I may even find a comely wench to warm the sheets for me. He spoke to one of the Black brothers, an old man with twisted back and a tangled beard. Yoren, we go south at daybreak. You will find me on the road, no doubt. With that, he made his exit, struggling across the hall on his short legs, past Rickon and out the door. His men followed. The 4 of the night's watch remained. Robb turned to them uncertainly. I have had rooms prepared, and you'll find no lack of hot water to wash the dust off the road. I will hope you will honor us at table tonight. He spoke the words so awkwardly that even Bran took note. It was a speech he had learned, not words from the heart, but the Black brothers thanked him all the same. Summer followed them up the tower steps as Hodor carried Bran back to his bed. Old Nan was sleeping in her chair. Hodor, said Hodor, gathered up great-grandmother and carried her off, snoring softly, while Bran lay thinking. Robb had promised that he could feast with the Night's Watch in the Great Hall. Summer, he called. The wolf bounded up to bed. Bran hugged him so hard he could feel the hot breath on his cheeks. I can ride now, he whispered to his friend. We can go hunting in the woods. Soon, wait and see. After a time, he slept. I mean, you got to train that horse. You got to build that saddle. It's really jumping there. In his dreams, he was climbing again, pulling himself up an ancient windowless tower. His fingers forcing himself between blackened stones, his feet scrambling for purchase. Higher and higher he climbed through the clouds and into the night sky, and still the tower rose before him. When he paused to look down, his head swam dizzily, and his fingers slipping. This dream of the tower continues on and on in Bran chapters. This mysterious tower. The earth was 1,000 miles beneath him, and he could not fly. He could not fly. He waited until his heart had stopped pounding, until he could breathe. And he began to climb again. There was no way to go but up. Far above him, outlined against the vast pale moon, he thought he could see the shapes of gargoyles. His arms were sore and aching, and dare not rest. He forced himself to climb faster. The gargoyles watched him ascend. Of course, Tyrion himself is always called a gargoyle, but I don't know in this context necessarily. Though these gargoyles don't seem to come back too much. Their eyes glowed red as hot coals in a brazier. Perhaps they'd been lions, but now they were twisted and grotesque. I mean, he's obviously, he's supposed to be thinking about Tyrion here now. The second guess, second. Bran could hear them whispering to each other in soft stone voices, terrible to hear. He must not listen, he told himself. He must not hear. So long as he did not hear them, he was safe. When the gargoyles pulled themselves loose from the stone and padded down the side of the tower to where Bran clung, he knew he was not safe after all. I didn't hear, he wept as they came closer and closer. I didn't. Oh, so... Okay, here's what's interesting here. And I guess I've never thought about this. I've never heard anyone in the fandom talk about this either. Very clearly, over and over, Tyrion is called a gargoyle. But here the gargoyle is very clearly supposed to be a Lannister. They had once been lions, now they're gargoyles. And the gargoyles coming down to find him, and obviously that's Cersei and Jaime. So it's interesting that so often the imagery for Tyrion being a gargoyle is continued, but I don't know of any ones for Jaime and Cersei continuing to be gargoyles. That's interesting. That in his dreams the Lannisters are the gargoyles, not just Tyrion, the Lannisters. Okay. I didn't hear. He woke gasping, lost in darkness, and saw a vast shadow looming over him. I didn't, he whispered, trembling in fear. But then the shadow said Hodor and lit the candle by the bedside, and Bran sighed with relief. Hodor washed the sweat from him with a warm, damp cloth and dressed him with deft and gentle hands. When it was time, he carried him down to the great hall where a long trestle table had been set up near the fire. The Lord's seat at the head of the table had been left empty, but Robb sat off to the right with Bran across from him. They ate suckling pig that night and pigeon pie and turnips soaked in butter, and afterwards the cook had promised honeycombs. George R.R. food porn. Summer snatched table scraps from Bran's hand while Grey Wind and Shaggy Dog fought over a bone in the corner. Winterfell's dogs would not come near the hall now. Bran had found that strange at first, but it was growing used to it. Oh my. This is a pretty long chapter for a Game of Thrones. I think this is around 5,000 words, and just as you see, just we have our meeting with Tyrion with the saddle, but man, there's just a lot of just descriptions and atmosphere. Yoren was senior among the Black brothers, so the steward had seated him between Robb and Maester Luwin. The old man had a sour smell, as if he had not washed in a long time. He ripped at the meat with his teeth, cracked the ribs, and sucked out the marrow from the bones, and shrugged at the mention of Jon Snow. Sir Alistair's bane, he grunted, and two of his companions shared a laugh that Bran did not understand. But when Robb asked for news of their Uncle Benjen, the Black brothers grew ominously quiet. What is it? Bran asked. Yoren wiped his fingers on his vest. There's hard news, my lords, and a cruel way to pay you for your mead, but the man as asked the question must bear the answer. Stark's gone. One of the other men said, the old bear sent him off to look for Waymore Royce, and he's late on returning, my lord. Too long, Yoren said. Most like he's dead. My uncle is not dead, Robb Stark said loudly, anger in his tones. He rose from the bench and laid his hand on the hilt of his sword. Do you hear me? My uncle's not dead. His voice rang against the stone walls, and Bran was suddenly afraid. Old sour-smelling Yoren looked up at Robb unimpressed. Whatever you say, my lord, he said. He suckled at a piece of meat between his teeth. That is it's pretty badass for Yoren. Yoren does act like a badass in A Clash of Kings, being pretty unimpressed with Lannister guards, wanting them to hand over Gendry. So this is the acting Lord of Winterfell with a sword. Whatever. The youngest of the Black brothers shifted uncomfortably in his seat. There's not a man on the wall knows the haunted forest better than Benjen Stark. He'll find his way back. I mean, what about... Well, I guess maybe Garrett, but Garrett's dead. Well, said Yoren, maybe he will, maybe he won't. Good men have gone into those woods before and never come out. All Bran could think of was old Nan's story of the others and the last hero. Hounded through the white woods by dead men and spiders as big as hounds. He was afraid for a moment until he remembered how the story ended. "The children will help him," he blurted. "The children of the forest." Theon Greyjoy sniggered, and Maester Luwin said, "Bran, the children of the forest have been dead and gone for thousands of years. All that's left of them are the faces on the trees. Down here might be that's true," Maester Yorn said, "but up past the wall, who's to say? Up there, a man can't always tell what's alive and what's dead." That night, after the plates had been cleared, Robb carried Bran up to his bed himself. Grey Wind led the way, and Summer came close behind. His brother was strong for his age, and Bran was as light as a bundle of rags. But the stairs were steep and dark, and Robb was breathing hard by the time they reached the top. He put Bran into bed, covering him with blankets, and blew out the candle. For a time, Robb sat beside him in the dark. Bran wanted to talk to him, but he didn't know what to say. "We'll find a horse for you, I promise," Robb whispered at last. "Are they ever coming back?" Bran asked him. "Yes," Robb said, with such hope in his voice that Bran knew he was hearing his brother and not just Robb the Lord. "Mother will be home soon. Maybe we can ride out to meet her when she comes. Wouldn't that surprise her, to see you a horse?" Even in the dark room, Bran could feel his brother's smile. "And afterward we'll ride north to see the wall. We won't even tell Jon we're coming. We'll just be there one day, you and me. It will be an adventure." "An adventure," Bran repeated wistfully. That's the thing, is Bran does make it to the wall, but he purposely avoids, Jon. He has that near miss with Jon, actually, unexpectedly. An adventure, Bran repeated wistfully. He heard his brother sob. The room was so dark he could not see the tears on Robb's face, so he reached out and found his hand. Their fingers twined together. So yeah, that's Bran 4. Again, another chapter that may or may not be necessary, but still, it was a lot of good world building, I suppose. Introduced us to the character of Yoren, introducing us to Hodor and Old Nan and Winterfell in general, and we got the very important saddle plot, So, but there it is. This is during the results of George's slow period, and next time we're going to get to Ned. Though I'll have to double check on this. I think this Ned chapter is written later on and then inserted, but we'll talk about this next time. Okay, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.